We have about 15 minutes for questions. We started 5 minutes late. I'm sure there are many. I'm trying to wiggle this out. There we go. Are there any questions?
You mentioned one of the studies, or one of the things you came across was you had climate deniers read science, and you thought, so this is interesting. I've run into some people like that, and I found they're around this area in Ottawa. They read the science, but they didn't want to talk to me. I worked in sustainable development, so they wanted to use that to browbeat other people that didn't know things that really were like soft climate deniers, and then they could give them their interpretation of that. Did you find the same thing, that they were using that as a tool and not talking to people that were also informed?
Well, I guess I can you I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand the question.
I was using your example.
Yeah.
You said that some of the deniers read more
Right.
science about climate change than a lot of other people did.
Right.
And I've run into some of those.
Right.
And I found but they didn't want to talk
Right.
about that science with people who were informed. They wanted to use it to take other people that didn't understand it.
I see what you mean. Yeah, no, I have seen that. What I find interesting is the point they make also, and this is why I talked about the distinction between kind of private concerns and public concerns. I have done some research looking at how farmers understand climate change and understand climate science. And they're quick to point out also in reference to why they're reluctant to turn what they view as a private issue into a public concern. I recently had a farmer talk about, well, you can connect everything, right? They've heard chaos theory, the butterfly flapping its wings in the Amazon can result in a hurricane. For them, being able to scientifically show that things are connected, isn't it for them a persuasive enough political argument to actually then create regulations that are based upon that scientific truth? And so they're very quick to make distinctions about just because something's scientifically valid doesn't necessarily make it a valid political point. And then they would take it to the next level and say, well, you could connect everything. And they're not saying, well, we got to regulate everything. They're using that to make the point that because we can connect everything, just because you can point to connections doesn't necessarily mean it will result in some type of regulation or some sort of policy change. And so that's why I think it's important to think about these distinctions between private concerns and public concerns, because these are the types of things that have come out when I've talked to people that are denying certain scientific evidence around things like climate science.
Hi, thank you very much. That was a great, entertaining presentation.
Thank you.
I really like the SoundCloud comparisons you made there.
Uh-huh.
We look at that data, and it's tempting to focus on the degree to which the results are mutually exclusive. Mm-hmm. But it's actually more useful to look at where they're not. So I wonder if you can comment on the extent to which there's overlap in the values between the two groups.
Sure, yeah. And this is something I've explored too, in terms of rather than just pointing out and making the argument that these individuals live in wildly different worlds in some respects and hold wildly different worldviews, trying to find ways in which there's some sort of overlap. And I think this is why I like showing the word clouds along with the heat maps, is that the idea of individualism comes up really strongly in the word clouds, and you also see it in the heat maps too. But remember that there was society, individual, and community, and individuals who seem to embrace the idea of individualism also embrace the idea of community very strongly as well. And so I had a quote, and I cut it for the sake of time. It was from an individual who lived in one of these frontier counties where the very low population density, and he talked to me about why for him community is so incredibly important, because for him, there lives in such a rural area, there are no healthcare services, there's no plumbers, the school district's spread out really far, the nearest cop is 100 miles away. It's them, it's their neighbors, it's them. If there's a birth, they need to rely upon their neighbor. If they need a water heater installed, they need to turn to somebody that they know to get this stuff done. And so it's not as though, you're absolutely right, it's not as though one group thinks, oh, it's just all about all about me and my own, and another group thinks it's all about us. But what us is means different things to different people, and we need to have some sort of conversation to realize that we all appreciate the importance of others in our lives, but who those others are sometimes are a little bit different, and maybe and more distant. So I think that's one thing that I've found really interesting and encouraging about this too, is that the individualism collectivism distinction is of course gross. It overgeneralizes, and I think we can find some nuance here. And this is why I think it's important to do some of these exploratory studies about how people think about the world and themselves in it, because it helps us understand things in a nuanced way that sometimes the stereotypes and the caricatures and the Twitters and everything like that kind of tends to over-amplify and exaggerate.
Hi, my name is Bo Fredvik. I work for the Environment Commission of Canada, presently on the agriculture portfolio. Thanks for sharing your social perspective of sustainable, of agriculture in general. Given that I work in the environmental field, we often forget that if we don't look at social perspectives, it doesn't matter what we find in the environment, because if you have a political system where social concerns are not taken into account, you have results like you have in the United States, where sustainable agriculture is not a priority right now. So my question is, if you were to pick 3 most pressing social issues in agriculture at the federal level, ideally in Canada, but I presume in the US, given your experience in the US, that the federal government is not doing and it is supposed to legally. And the reason why I'm asking that is because our framework is to look at things in terms of likelihood and impact. So we look at risks. And from a social perspective, what are the 3 biggest risks that we're not getting towards sustainable agriculture in the US?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you for that. The economic realities that are being faced in rural areas. And again, I know the U.S. case far better than Canada, so I can only assume from what I know that there's a lot of parallels. But the economic realities that are being faced in rural areas in North America more generally, especially post-recession when you look at the data, that seems to be a tremendous risk. It's an aging population which requires different services and different needs, and often those services do tend to cost a little bit more. And yet it's an economically vulnerable population in an economically vulnerable space. And so one thing that I think is really important that I don't think we think enough about, and this is why I wanted to mention it at the very end, I think it's an opportunity. There's all of this interest and excitement around regional and metropolitan food plans. And I think it's a missed opportunity, just in the sense that if you could find ways in which creating a metropolitan or urban food plan that is intentional and seriously takes into consideration ways in which to integrate itself with the countryside and the social and economic needs of rural farmers and rural communities, given the fact that given the economic realities that they're facing. And certainly, at least in the States, with the trade war and other things like this, it could be a real social and economic opportunity if you could create better rural-urban linkages, social linkages, infrastructural linkages, supply chain linkages that could help benefit not just urbanites and urban entrepreneurs, but they could also reinvigorate rural communities as we try to create some medium-length value chains as opposed to value chains that have historically reached out to China and other things like that. And I think finding ways in which you can find win-win solutions in the space that connect up rural and urban areas, I think is an important way in which, from a political standpoint as well as the social and economic one, I think is something that we're not thinking enough about. And I'm saying this again in the States because there's been a real push after the most recent presidential election to think of ways in which we can bring rural areas back into the fold, because that the way the 2016 election broke so clearly for Trump really suggests, and given who Trump is, just in a sense of this is a man that's lived his whole life in a city and is a celebrity. Every aspect of him you would think would be antithetical to what a rural person would value and embrace, right? He represents almost the opposite of what you would think 10 years ago a rural individual would vote for, and yet they did. And I think they did that precisely because of the experiences they're having post-recession. Whether those experiences are accurate or not, they're real, and it needs to be something we need to think more about. I don't know if that answers your question, but I really think about the need to better integrate rural and urban politics, and especially around food, I think is a missed opportunity that we have in the U.S. at least.
I have just a couple kind of related questions. I was thinking back to the point you made about somebody who was giving a talk somewhere and said, this stuff's been said by Trump, and listen to all the snickers or whatever, and probably worse. And then it turned out, oh no, he said it was by Obama. Oh. And I'm just curious, you didn't really tell us how you interpreted that or what you thought about that, but there is an issue about how you go about doing research and how that kind of thing fits into it. So that's one thing. The second thing, I was curious that when you were talking about a woman called Lisa, you were reading from her quotes from what she said, and there was a picture on the screen that had a face, and I'm wondering if that is Lisa, or if really it's just kind of an avatar, and maybe it's not a woman, maybe it's a man or something. And then I'm wondering about the next thing that we saw, which was a man's back. And I'm just curious about the juxtaposition of the woman's face and the man's back. And just to bring it back full circle, I'm sitting here, and we were, the introducer of perhaps it was you or perhaps it was someone else was talking about something, how we're taking a kind of, I don't remember what the exact words were, but orthogonal perspective. I've been in this room many times to listen to many different lectures on all kinds of things that might seem interesting. And I couldn't help but noticing this is the first time that we've all been sitting in a way that's orthogonal, at total right angles. And we are sitting here, I don't know if you know it, but we are sitting here peeking into the windows of the headquarters of the Department of National Defense. And when you were talking about, I think it was Lisa and the study and how she was triggered by various things, what I couldn't help thinking while I'm sitting here listening to this, what about those guys over there in Afghanistan when it was landmines? And what might they have been triggered by, when they got back here, sounds and smells? And how much fun would that have been?
Maybe we'll let Michael answer just the first question.
Yeah, sure.
Just give room for other people.
The methodological issues is important. How this research was presented was not in the sense of, I want to see if you're a Democrat, I want to make you a Republican, or if you're a Republican, I want to see if I can turn you into a Democrat. But I couched it as being, I'm interested in how knowledge impacts us in different ways, and try to understand how we understand things as a result of experiences and as a result of how knowledge comes to us, whether it's in written or representative form, or whether it's through experience. And so part of everything that I did, and I mentioned this a little bit with which one was it when I talked about the strawberry study, they were also given opportunities to experience information. So when I redid the strawberry study, just to give you one example of this, I also created a website that was full of information, data around immigrant labor and the experiences of the immigrant labor. And I gave them all a link to that website. They were invited to look at it, and then when they clicked on the link, I could track it so I know if they looked or not. And I also looked at how often, if they looked at it before they were undergoing the experience, or if they looked at it after. And it was interesting in the sense of hardly anybody clicked on the link before the experience, but almost everybody clicked on the link after the experience. And I never got a chance to talk about that, but I think it points to, knowledge. This isn't a world of alternative facts. Facts still matter, but we have to figure out ways in which we can disarm people in the sense of weakening or mitigating some of that motivated reasoning or that those cognitive filters so people can be more receptive to the information. And so I was always honest with what people were told in terms of what the purpose of the research was. And those were not actual pictures of people, because I've always been respectful of people's identities, and I only have used pictures of people if they give me their express permission, or I only use their name if they give me their express permission. And sometimes, as I mentioned, sometimes I promise not even to identify the city if we're talking about politically sensitive subjects. So.
Thank you. Okay, one question here, and then I think.
Hi,
Hi.
Michael. I traveled very far to get here today to see you. I'm glad I did. My question is, I'm wondering what happens when we put kind of power into the equation here, and maybe let's say an intersectionality lens. So at one level, you're talking about beliefs and ideas and how people may be exposed and change, but how does, I guess, the experience of power kind of play into this? So, if you're say a black farmer who's had land taken away and you're still facing racism, or if you're, an indigenous person, a First Nations person who's had land taken away and, you're trying to talk to settlers who have no interest or ability to kind of have these conversations. So I'm just wondering, are there boundaries in terms of the analysis and who this works for, or can we extend it to kind of impact or play into some of these realities where people are experiencing kind of real power imbalances? Yeah,
the issue of power is important. The issue of power is also why I had experimented with the idea of seeing if this experiment around the notion of trying to put oneself into another person's shoes. And of course, I don't have the time or necessarily want to take the time to get into the philosophical arguments and about whether or not it's even possible to put yourself in another person's shoes. I'm always reluctant to speak in absolutes, right? Just because it's problematic as a white male to try to put yourself in the shoes of, say, a non-documented female immigrant laborer working a strawberry field, just because it's difficult and impossible to do it perfectly. I'm also reluctant to just say, well, there's nothing that can be learned from having people go through that experience. And so the issue of power is very salient in that sense. It's also very salient in the sense of I wanted to try to think about the putting yourself in other people's shoes position precisely because of some power imbalances and not wanting to expose potentially vulnerable populations that would naturally come about if you really wanted to kind of force groups that are socially othered into the same room with people who are historically of a social position that could be potentially threatening to someone who's been historically socially othered. So I know this really doesn't answer your question other than say it's stuff I've thought about. One of the things that I think that we don't think enough about as social scientists when we think about issues of social movements is asking the question of what makes somebody want to be a participant in a social movement to begin with. I kind of broached that a little bit around the movement toward professionally facilitated conversations and about how people self-select to be part of those groups and to have these conversations, but we never asked the question, what made somebody choose to be a part of that conversation to begin with? I like to ask that question too. What makes somebody want to be part of a social movement? What makes somebody choose to take up the time and energy and to protest and to risk life and limb in some cases to march the streets and say, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore? And I'm interested in kind of those prefigurative moments. What makes somebody go from being not satisfied with the status quo, but satisfied enough to not take those risks to be in this position to suddenly say, this isn't right and I need to do something about it. And this is what led me to, from my experience at least, it's not because they necessarily read anything. It's not because they saw, maybe they saw a documentary. It's not something they were lectured to by a professor. Something deeper touched them. In my experience with activists, something deep touched them and made them want to be an activist. And I'm interested in what that it is that touched them, to think about how we might learn from that and glean insights so that those things could be intentionally kind of reproduced and give other people those experiences to have those deeply transformative attitudinal and value shifts.
Thank you so much. It was very, very cool. Can you talk a little bit about how individuals processed or reflected on or expressed or dealt with the change they experienced? Like, was there a sense of, I was wrong before and now I've seen the light, or I'm not comfortable acknowledging the change, or I acknowledge the change and I'm doing new behavior? Like, what was the internal or expressed to you dialogue about the change they experienced?
It was all over the board. There was some people talked about wanting to actually seek absolution and to talk to people that they had others and potentially others that they had victimized, to the point of just being really uncomfortable with their past actions, such as in the case of when I sometimes reread transcripts and recounted how they spoke about something during the first interview. It made them very uncomfortable. Oftentimes they did have difficulty trying to put into words how they're feeling as they were trying to process what they were thinking about, which again makes me think about make distinction between a Headland and Heartland model. I think, the fact that we have a difficulty putting what we're feeling into words speaks to the fact that there's something more than just something that's cognitive and rational going on in how we interact with others and how we understand the world. So I don't take that as a slight or take that as somebody who's inarticulate, but when they say, I felt the change in my gut, I think that is in some ways a metaphor for them trying to put into words something that cannot easily be put into words by evoking a type of embodied metaphor. And so it spanned the board, but what I found often is people do have a difficult time talking about it, in part because it's uncomfortable, but in part because I think there's something that goes beyond just it being a matter of what's going on up here and something that's more physical and visceral that's harder to put in words, which is precisely why I think as scholars, because we deal in the currency of representation in words, while we've had such success and fascination with studying social movements, again, just to go back to what I was talking about, and why we're slow to pick up on those prefigurative moments that led us to feel that gut change that caused us to suddenly be activist or wanting to take an action that is completely different from who we might have been just prior to that.
Great. So thank you, Michael, for a really stimulating talk. I look forward to reading the book. I guess maybe picking up on that last point that you just mentioned, I really thought your argument about engagement through empathy and through emotion as being really a really salient point, and the studies you gave, I think, really speak to that. I guess my question is, where do we go from that? How can we scale that upwards? Or is this just incumbent upon food scholars doing this kind of scholarship, or do you see how this translates to policy or how this translates to activism more broadly?
Yeah, that's something I'm thinking about right now. It's no secret, right, about empathy and the power of empathy. You look at every sacred religious text going back millennium, and it all talks about the power of empathy. This is something we've known for a really, really long time. The famous book Nickel and Dimed, right, from 2001, of the author, where she went about and tried to live the life of somebody who is the working poor. New York Times bestseller. It's a brilliant piece. I think every student for a few years at the undergrad level read that book at least twice. I certainly assigned it in all my classes. We know the power that can be had when you try to do some of these things, and yet nothing has changed, and in fact things have only gotten worse. So I don't think the 1,000 flowers blooming approach, I don't think we can rest our hopes on just it happening organically. I do think this needs to be something that there needs to be leadership, not just amongst the academy, but leadership amongst politicians to talk more about the importance of public service, maybe rethinking and being really innovative around creating some sort of policy that gets people involved in community-based projects, food-based projects, not because they're told to do so by the government, but creating spaces that are welcoming so people actually would want to do that. Because again, we have to remember, this is of course the danger. You can't just legislate it, because when you force people into these spaces, I've already said repeatedly that this can't be something that people feel like they're not choosing to do, because then it becomes an elbows out, and people resort to creating these categories of us versus them and friend and enemy. So really thinking intentionally about how we can create spaces that allow people to choose to do this for purposes perhaps other than getting to know somebody that's different from themselves, but inevitably, if they're with somebody that's different from themselves through these encounters, maybe something transformative can transpire. So.
I think we have 2 more questions, Margaret and then Alana.
Thank you. I wondered if you could just comment on what you're going to be doing here in Ottawa for the coming months. I think you're going to be working with Dr. Bronson, and so maybe you can say a little bit about that.
I know, yeah, that's a very good question. It's actually a huge pivot from what we've just been talking about, because while it has to do with food and agriculture, it honestly doesn't have all that much to do with what I just said, because this is another project I've been doing in the United States, but we thought it would be a good talk because you have the elections coming up and we have elections coming up. So what I'm proposing to do with Kelly, and what I have been doing in the United States, is I'm looking at issues related to digital agriculture and automation and robotics and technological innovation in an agricultural context, and trying to understand how it impacts rural communities and rural farmers, and try to understand also kind of the imaginaries that lie behind our, in some cases, utopic understandings of agriculture, where they come from, what do they mean, what do they cause us to think about? What do they cause us to ignore? And so I'm looking at digital agriculture, what we're calling more generally digital agriculture, and doing perhaps a cross-cultural, if we're different cultures, I'm not entirely sure, cross-national comparison between the United States and Canada in that space. So, yeah.
I think one more question.
Thanks so much. This was really, really interesting. I have a question that I hope isn't too personal. You've mentioned in a few different cases how you were incorporating some of these ideas around embodied learning into your teaching practice. Mm-hmm. Kelly talked in her introduction about sort of how you clearly care about your work, and that really shone through. And I'm curious about, I'd like to hear more about sort of how you are thinking about sort of what you've learned around sort of embodied learning in terms of your teaching practice, and also in terms of how you're communicating your research, right, and whether you're thinking about whether you have sort of come up with interesting strategies for communicating what you are learning through this work.
Well, on the communication part, this is why I like experimenting with different ways of presenting data, and so why I showed heat maps and word clouds and things like that. I'm trying to rethink how data can be presented, whether visually or experimenting with doing readings, although that's perhaps the most representational. But anyway, I am experimenting with how data can be presented. One thing I think that you might find interesting, it relates to not just myself as a teacher, but myself, I have the position of being also an administrator partially too. I've been trying to put some of my learnings to work in that sense. And so something that I've been doing at my university is, we all know what study abroad is, and we all certainly know the value of study abroad. And I'm certainly not one to take any value away from that, especially given what I've just said about us needing to be experiencing difference in a very physical way and not just seeing it from a lecture hall. But I've always found it rather striking in at least the United States that I have encountered a lot of students that have a heck of a more experience living and experiencing other cultures in other countries than they do experiencing people from rural communities and having rural experiences. And so one thing that I've been trying to do at my university, and we've been doing this now for 2 years, is to complement the study abroad model. We're doing what I refer to as a study away. And so I'm giving research experience to advanced undergraduates and graduate students, where they can go to a rural community and provide their expertise as a researcher, and I partner them up with. We have an extension model at land-grant universities, which is where you have people that are associated with the university living on the ground in almost every county in many of the states as extension agents, and it provides a very sort of physical and institutional link between rural communities and the home land-grant university. And traditionally, it was for a very kind of unidirectional way of pushing out knowledge to farmers. Now it's become much more dialogical in a sense of the arrows going many different ways. And so I pair students up with an extension mentor that's embedded within a rural community. They move to the rural community over the summer, and then they have a faculty mentor at my university who can provide the research expertise. And they go there to help resolve or solve rural problems that were self-identified by the rural communities. And then they bring that experience back with them and they talk about it to their students. They give poster presentations and other things like that. And I mentioned this a little bit in the book at the very concluding chapter as I encourage people to think about how we can think beyond food and create some sort of encounters that might be transformative too. The students who have done this, many of whom had never lived in a rural community, have very little experience in a rural community, have come back really changed as a result of living there for 3 months and seeing what it's like to be someplace that has a dwindling tax base and experiencing some of the livelihoods around having to drive for 20 minutes to the nearest grocery store, and that grocery store is really small, and what it means to maybe do a 3-hour round trip to the nearest Costco. It's been a really meaningful experience for many of them, and it's something that I've had conversations with other administrators about at other universities as we think about some of these rural-urban divides that have impacted our country too. And I think that might be a place where our universities can really contribute too, is also not just political leaders, but I think universities could really help facilitate the creation of some of these spaces to help this happen as well. And Kelly sneaking up on me?
I am, because we're never good at talking about ourselves. I'm going to say something about you in front of you. In response to Alana's, I said that in the intro that Michael cares about his work, but I also said he's refreshingly unguarded. And I think one way that you kind of evoke your pro-affect methodology is you bring emotion, right? I mean, I think that was visible to all of us here into your presentation of your material, which I really appreciate as an academic. Following from Mike's question, if we think of our populist politicians in Canada, I'm thinking of Rob Ford, they're really great at bringing affect into their campaigns, right? I think they appeal to people who are really frustrated in their lives for a host of kind of structural and systemic reasons because they promise to do something. And so academics are not that great at doing, social scientists maybe particularly. So anyway, so I think that one thing we could do is be a little bit more like you and be honest and unguarded. That's my plea. That's what I appreciate about your work. So I think that we don't have any more questions. Thank you all for coming. Please stick around for some nibblies and conversation. Thank you very much. And we'll probably see you again over Michael's course during his Fulbright here at uOttawa.